Welcome to this introduction of BaseSpace Clarity LIMS. As you may know, Illumina has a suite of informatics products designed to help you integrate key informatics tools and allow you to go end-to-end from sample to analysis. BaseSpace Clarity LIMS sits right at the front of the informatics suite, where we track samples, automate the wet lab, as well as keep track of many other components necessary for your day-to-day lab usage. Clarity LIMS is the next generation of genomics LIMS. What we mean by that is, this is a LIMS designed specifically for the genomics lab. Combinations of our pre-configured protocols and out-of-the-box integrations help get your lab up and running quickly. Our real-time dashboarding and lab operational report options allow you to keep track of everything that's happening in your lab. Combine this with audit trail and support for regulatory compliance, and BaseSpace Clarity LIMS can help you get your genomics lab up and running quickly as well as efficiently. In LIMS, we track laboratory samples from the time the sample is submitted through the QC and sample preparation, while keeping track of controls and reagents used, as well as what pools you create. We also have out-of-the-box integration to many next-generation sequencers, allowing you to set up a run and monitor those runs when they're completed. Those core components of Clarity LIMS can be supplemented by our lab reporting module, as well as extension of the system via our API. We'll talk more specifically about both of those later. Many times the question of why is a LIMS important comes up. We know that in your lab it's critical to know where all your samples are, what has been done to them in the past, as well as what work needs to be done. We want to help facilitate streamlining those complex tasks, as well as automating components like parsing data files from standard instruments and generating sample sheets to automate those routine tasks of setting up an instrument. So now let's talk about the core features and functionalities of BaseSpace Clarity LIMS. Imagine, if you will, BaseSpace Clarity LIMS in your lab. Every day as the lab manager, I want to come in and understand exactly what samples I have, where they are throughout my pipeline, and what samples might be in the backlog or coming up. Our real-time dashboards are excellent for this functionality. Our overview dashboard allows you to see at a quick glance how many samples are in your lab, how many workflows are active, and if we focus in on the TruSeq PCR-free for HiSeq workflow, we can see exactly how many samples are in each protocol. I can see I've got 48 samples prepared to go on my HiSeq, but over 300 samples coming through library prep. So as a lab manager, this might give me an idea I need to be prepared for more sequencing to come in the next few days. In this workflow, I can see I have 484 samples in progress that are represented by 2 projects. As the lab manager or project manager, I want to dig into those specifics in order to answer questions from customers or just to keep track of where my samples from a specific project are. Our projects dashboard allows you to get just that information. A project in LIMS is a group of samples. That group of samples might represent a specific quote number, a date when certain samples were received, or a specific assay or workflow these samples are destined for. But if I want to drill into any specific project, we'll take this whole genome sequencing, for example. I can see a summary of that project, as well as the specifics of any workflow samples within that project are running. This allows me a quick and easy place to check on the progress of particular samples, as well as field questions from customers about how long something might take or where exactly their samples are throughout the process. Using our dashboards, lab managers or project managers can easily keep track of everything that's going on in their lab. These dashboards update in real time, so anytime a new sample is created or new work is completed, these dashboards will update. As a lab technician or sample accessioner, my focus might be on how do I get samples into the LIMS. Our projects and sample screen focuses specifically on accessioning samples. At last count, there were over 7 different ways to accession samples into the LIMS. The way you choose to accession samples depends a lot on what type of lab you are and how you receive samples. If you receive samples 1 or 2 at a time by opening a FedEx box, you might choose our sample management accessioning screen, which we'll show in a moment. But if you receive hundreds of samples at once, You might not want to enter each piece of that information on a screen. You might want to consume it from an Excel spreadsheet. Here on the Projects and Sample screen, I can easily see that same project that we were just talking about, the whole genome sequencing project, as well as all of the samples that have been accessioned into that project, or a part of that project. To add new samples, I'm simply going to click the Add Samples button. This is going to bring up our sample management screen. This screen allows me to accession one or many samples into this same project at one time. You'll notice that all the project details are pre-populated. If we focus in on the sample details, we can see things like sample name, what container it was received in, as well as other fields for metadata about that particular sample. When a sample arrives in your lab, what questions do you need to answer? What type of sample is it? What methodology are they requesting? What kit or genes are they interested in assessing? Sample submission will allow you to collect all of that information. So we'll accession sample number 1. These example fields show you the power of configuration in LIMS. We'll talk more about configuration, but keep in mind these aren't the only questions you might want to ask about your sample. Maybe in your lab there is other metadata that you want to track as a sample comes in, perhaps about the condition of the shipment or a quote number associated with that particular sample. These fields are custom fields and are configurable specifically for your laboratory. To submit this sample, we'll simply click Submit Samples. Once my sample is submitted, I'll be able to see it here in the Samples and Workflow Assignment area and be able to assign it to a particular workflow. Workflow in LIMS helps us keep track of what a sample should do throughout our laboratory. You might think of it as your standard operating procedure. Maybe I start at DNA extraction, on to QC, into a library prep, and then on to a sequencer. By defining these workflows, there's no question to the lab technician about what steps samples should run or what comes next in the process. Let's assign this sample to the TruSeq PCR-free for HiSeq workflow. Once the workflow is assigned, I'm actually ready to do work. So this Projects and Sample screen allows me to easily get samples into the LIMS, but now we want to talk about the heart of the LIMS, the lab view. So as we've mentioned, LIMS is about keeping track of our samples, knowing exactly what steps they should run, exactly what reagents are used on them, and who touched that sample over time. Here in our lab view, as a lab technician, this is where my focus is going to be on a day-to-day basis. In the Available Work section, I can see all of my protocols organized in the idea of a queue. So how many samples are waiting for me at each particular step. I can see at fragment DNA, I've got 49 samples waiting for fragment DNA. If I take a look at this fragment DNA step, the first thing I'll see is the queue view, all the samples that are waiting for me here, and allow me to create a batch or select a group of samples to work on. In my ice bucket, I'm taking possession of these samples. Think of it as a shopping cart. I'm checking these samples out so no one can work on this step on these samples at the same time. Here in the ice bucket, I can also indicate what type of container I'm going to place these samples in. LIMS is going to help you keep track of those plate-to-plate and tube-to-plate movements. As we begin our work, the first thing we'll see is our placement screen. As I mentioned, keeping track of where that sample was, what plate it touched, is critically important when you talk about troubleshooting. I'll select all my samples and place them on my 96-well plate. When I arrive at the Record Details screen, this is the screen that's tracking all the science. What reagents did I use? Maybe what instrument settings, as well as keeping track of who's logged in and what date and time was this sample completed. This information is important in order to be able to meet those regulatory compliance needs. Should an auditor come in and ask what happened to blood sample 404, LIMS is going to allow me to search, find that sample, and know exactly what steps it completed and the date and time of who completed it. In this fragment DNA step, much like in our sample submission, these fields can be customized. Maybe you're not using a Covaris for your fragmentation, or maybe there's additional information you want to keep track of on this screen. Using our configuration screens, you'd be able to add new fields as well as new drop-down or default values. Our reagent lot tracking is focused on making sure we're not using expired reagents. In our reagents and controls screen, I can accession reagents into my system, assign them a lot number, as well as an expiration date. When I scan or type in my lot number for the reagents I'm going to use, the LIMS is going to check against that list, make sure this is a active and not expired reagent. This prevents you from using expired reagents, as well as gives you a way to look back in any troubleshooting cases. If there was a recall, for example, on a specific lot number, LIMS allows you to search for that lot number to find out every time it was used and every sample it affected. Our lab view also helps you keep track of those complicated steps in a sequencing workflow. Things like pooling, as well as adding indexes and setting up a instrument run. If we take pooling as an example, I have a pooling step here in progress. We would have selected the samples we wanted to pool and arrive at the pooling screen. This allows me to create combinations and create pools that I'm going to run later on my HiSeq. I can create as many pools as I need, but LIMS is always checking to make sure that none of my indexes are identical or that I'm not pooling samples that have no index. That way, preventing you from making the error of sequencing samples that can't be demultiplexed. For the last feature in this section, let's talk about integration. Out-of-the-box integrations and pre-configured protocols provide a lot of power to our LIMS user. Pre-configured protocols are based on the manufacturer's recommendations about what steps you should take, what calculations you should perform, as well as what reagents you should. So instead of having a blank LIMS when you begin, using these pre-configured protocols can get you up and running much quicker. In a similar way, out-of-the-box integrations allow you to automate some of those more mundane data moving tasks. For example, our QC instrument integrations allow you to create a file to use on your bioanalyzer, so you don't have to go back and type all that information again, as well as consume the file that's created by bioanalyzer or caliper or tape station in order to parse that data back into LIMS. No need to do double entry where mistakes might be generated. Our sequencing integrations typically come in two components. First is the creation of a sample sheet or a run definition. If we take a look at this cluster generation step as an example, for the first portion of the integration is creating a sample sheet or a run setup file. The information and questions you'd see on a run setup step differ based on the instrument. If I fill out each of the required details, I have the ability to then create the sample sheet. Sometimes this sample sheet is used to actually set up and run the instrument, or in the case of HiSeq, it can simply be used as an input to the downstream BCL to FASTQ conversion. Once I push the button, an automation is running in the background. This automation is taking all the information I gave it, including what indexes are assigned to those samples, what pool they're in, and creating a sample sheet in the defined format. These formats can be different based on the instrument that you're running. In the message box, you can see data being added. Once the automation is complete, we'll see a successful message and note that we can now download that sample sheet. So for the first part of the integration, we've enabled you to create a sample sheet that's compatible with either the instrument or the downstream analysis. So next step would be to set up the run on the instrument and look at the second part of the integration. I've indicated that this flow cell should move on to the sequencing step. So when I hit Finish Step, we can see that my samples have moved from the cluster generation step to the Illumina sequencing step. Through configuration, we could automatically have made this step begin. But let's select our flow cell and move to the Record Details screen. In real life, what you would do is take that flow cell, scan it into your instrument, and walk away. As the instrument starts to sequence, LIMS will be listening specifically for that flow cell ID. As the run continues and as the run completes, LIMS is going to populate back all the data you see on the screen. First, that top-level run information. What was the flow cell ID? What kit did you use to run this? What was the run ID? As well as those per lane metrics that might be interesting. Percentage pass filter, cluster density. Once the run is complete, all of this data the run data, as well as your run info and run parameters files will be attached to the LIMS. This allows you to sort of close the circle between sample that came in and run that was completed. In your laboratory, you'll be able to assess the quality of a run and assign a QC flag on whether each particular lane passed or failed. Downstream of this, you've got many options. One is to use BaseSpace Sequence Hub to automate your BCL conversion to FASTQ and pipeline those FASTQ files onto downstream analysis. Another option is to use our API to connect the LIMS to your own in-house analysis pipeline. So we covered the core features and functionalities of BaseSpace Clarity LIMS. Now let's talk about what's new. Our most recent release is BaseSpace Clarity LIMS 5.0, and in this release we have a single web-based interface that allows you to easily learn, use, and teach new people to use the LIMS. We've expanded our support for tablets and touchscreens. We've simplified and expanded our configuration. This configuration is non-developer configuration. It doesn't require a special skill set or learning a computer programming language. This allows your lab to evolve your LIMS as fast as your science is evolving. Let's take a look at that new configuration functionality. When you log into LIMS, if you have the proper permissions, you'll see our configuration tab. Our configuration tab allows you to harness all that power in LIMS and customize it to meet your specific needs. If we take a look at that workflow, TruSeq PCR free for HiSeq, we can see all of the protocols that are used in that, as well as a highlight of each step that was used to create those protocols. This helps me highlight the relationships between those entities, so I understand that if I make a change to any particular protocol or step, what workflows I might be affecting. Creating new things in LIMS is quite easy. If I want to create a new workflow, for example, I'd simply push this purple plus button. I can create a new workflow. Let's say I want to run PCR free, but I want to run it for MySeq instead of HiSeq. I can give it a name, and when I press save, the middle section here prompts me to start adding protocols that would make up this workflow. So I'd like to use initial DNA QC, TruSeq PCR free library prep, library validation QC, and then for my MySeq. I can see that this workflow has automatically saved the order of my protocols. In order to use this workflow in my lab, all I need to do is click activate and save. This workflow is now ready to be used by any of my laboratory technicians and assign samples to. One of the other most powerful configurations in LIMS is around custom fields. If you remember back to that sample submission example, we saw a bunch of metadata that we might be interested in collecting about our submitted sample as it came into our lab. Sample type, reference genome, methodology. But as I noted, there might be different questions your lab wants to ask. If I wanted to create a new custom field to track new data, I could simply click the plus button. I would now be prompted to enter a name for that field. Let's call it reference ID. And I know that that reference ID is going to be a numeric value, and I want to require a reference ID to be assigned with every submitted sample that comes into my lab. So I can quickly and easily create that field, designate the specific type of field it should be, and make it required, and hit save. Now, if I navigated back to that sample management screen we saw earlier, I'll note that my new reference ID field is here, ready to be filled out and indicated that it's required. So no samples could be submitted to your lab without that required piece of information. The simple web-based interface for configuration allows anyone, even someone who's not an IT person, to configure the LIMS and create custom fields in order for LIMS to track the same data that you're interested in tracking in your laboratory. Along with those core functionalities and our expanded configuration, LIMS also offers integrations and pre-configured protocols. We spoke a little bit about these during the demo, but pre-configured protocols reduce your time to implementation. Sometimes, starting from a blank LIMS can be terrifying, and we don't want you to get frozen with all the configuration options. So pre-configured protocols provide you a template for common genomics applications, QC, library preps, as well as sequencing applications, to give you a place to start to get you into production sooner. Another way to get the most out of your LIMS is to use our out-of-the-box integrations. Integrations range from standard integrations that create a simple run setup sheet to fully automated integrations that use our API to communicate directly to another instrument. Out-of-the-box integrations are available for a variety of common genomics instruments, everything from next-gen sequencers, qPCR machines, microarray platforms, as well as other technologies. Along with our core functionality and our out-of-the-box components, we offer 2 other features that allow you to extend and report on your LIMS. For IT and bioinformatics, we provide a way for you to extend the system by connecting it to other systems, triggering analysis pipelines, integrating with your robots, or maybe just using a script to automate lab interactions. Our REST API has been used by many customers to extend the functionality of their LIMS to reach out and touch other components throughout their institute. In addition to extending via the API, we also have a reporting module. We're tracking an excellent amount of data in LIMS, what samples were completed, what reagents were used, who did what work. The reporting module allows me to create, edit, and view analytic reports about my lab metrics. These are great for things like troubleshooting and trends across your lab. The reporting module allows you to ask questions like, show me the top 50 projects we did last year, or what's the average turnaround time for my HiSeq workflow. In this introduction, we've talked not only about the core functionality of Clarity LIMS, from sample submission through instrument preparation, but we also spoke about pre-configured protocols and out-of-the-box integrations that help you get into production sooner, as well as the ability to extend the LIMS via the API or use our lab reporting module to really dig into those lab trends and analytics. If you're interested in more information about BaseSpace Clarity LIMS, please visit our product page